The sound of 200 high-backed mahogany chairs scraping against polished marble at the exact same millisecond didn't sound like furniture. It sounded like the sharp, synchronized clack of service rifles chambering rounds in an empty canyon. Then came the silence. The kind of heavy, pressurized quiet that settles inside an operations room when a radar screen goes completely blank over a hostile grid. Outside the towering, arched windows of the Norfolk Maritime Pavilion, the coastal storm slammed sheets of gray Atlantic water against the reinforced glass. But inside, the only audible sound was the rhythmic, crystalline drip of melting ice from an overturned seafood tower onto the linen cloth. My brother, Garrick, stood frozen with his right hand extended toward a microphone, his mouth slightly open as if the next syllable of his speech had turned to dry ash on his tongue. The high-gloss sheen of his designer tuxedo lapels looked suddenly artificial under the harsh white glare of the venue's emergency floodlights. His face, usually flushed with the expensive pink glow of a man who owned 3 car dealerships and a commercial real estate firm, had drained to the color of wet newsprint. Beside him, his father-in-law, Arthur Vance, the architect of the evening, and the undisputed patriarch of Virginia Beach logistics, slowly lowered his tumbler of single malt scotch. The amber liquid sloshed over his manicured fingers, but he didn't seem to notice. His eyes were locked on the heavy double doors at the back of the grand ballroom. I did not move. I remained seated at the smallest, roundest table near the service kitchen hallway, tucked neatly behind a decorative fern where the catering staff stacked dirty trays. I was wearing a dark, unstructured wool dress, bought off the rack 5 years ago. My hair was pulled into a severe, military regulation bun that felt like a dull spike driven into the base of my skull. I looked down at my hands. They were steady. But to explain why that room stopped breathing, I need to take you back to the day the salt water first got into the wood. My name is Sarah Jennings. I am 51 years old. If you walked into the small, gravel-strewn airfield near the Great Dismal Swamp at 3 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, you would find me sitting in a windowless plywood office, tracking tail numbers for local crop dusters and private single-engine Cessnas on an outdated monitor. I live in a modest, one-bedroom cottage near the salt marshes where the roof leaks when the wind blows from the northeast, and my truck requires a quart of oil every 300 miles. I walk with a slight, almost imperceptible hitch in my right hip, the permanent legacy of a hard landing on the pitching deck of a carrier in a Sea State 5, and my lungs ache with a dull, chemical heat whenever the humidity crosses 80%. It is a reminder of the 5 minutes I spent breathing atomized JP-5 jet fuel inside a burning hangar bay before the automated foam systems triggered. For the last 4 years, since I quietly processed my retirement papers at Naval Station Norfolk, my family believed I had spent my 22 years of active service working as a Grade 7 logistics clerk in a subterranean warehouse at Fort Meade. They thought I filled out requisition forms for heavy-duty paperclips and tracked missing boots. I let them believe it. Explaining weight to the weightless is a waste of breath. When my mother asked why I didn't have a house with a wraparound porch like Garrick's, I simply told her the government pension didn't cover real estate commissions. I never corrected that assumption. Modesty isn't an accident when you've seen the world from 40 feet above a freezing ocean. It is a deliberate disguise. It is a conscious test to see how people treat someone they believe has absolutely nothing to offer them. My mother used to say, "A woman with real steel in her spine doesn't need to rattle her cage to prove she's there. The world will eventually do the announcing for her." I kept that steel buried deep beneath my old civilian coat, waiting to see exactly who my brother would become when he thought nobody was looking. Garrick entered the family business the way a parasitic vine enters an old oak quietly at first, then with an insatiable hunger for the sunlight. After our father passed away in 2012, leaving behind a small, independent coastal shipping brokerage with 4 diesel trucks and a debt-free warehouse on the Elizabeth River, Garrick didn't see a legacy. He saw a stepping stone. Within 3 years, he had married Bethany Vance, the daughter of the city's largest commercial developer, and transformed our father's honest name into Jennings Global Logistics, a shell company built on high-interest loans, leased luxury SUVs, and a glossy marketing narrative that promised strategic government consulting without ever owning a single piece of government clearance. The pattern of contempt began during the first Thanksgiving, after my final deployment to the Mediterranean. I had arrived late, straight from the tarmac, still wearing my sea bag smell of grease and canvas. Garrick had looked at my faded duffel bag sitting by the front door, turned to his father-in-law, and said with a thin, nasal chuckle, "Be careful with that corner, Arthur. My sister brings the warehouse bureaucracy with her. If we aren't careful, she'll audit the gravy." The room had chuckled. I had simply reached for my water glass and looked at the molding on the ceiling. Layer by layer, the erasure grew. In the summer of 2021, when our mother passed, Garrick took it upon himself to clear out the old family home. I returned from a temporary assignment in San Diego to find our father's framed flight deck crew photographs from the USS Enterprise sitting beside the curb in a cardboard box marked trash. When I confronted him, Garrick hadn't even looked up from his iPad. "Guests don't need the museum tour of the war, Sarah," he said, his voice smooth and dripping with the casual cruelty of a man who had never held anything heavier than a golf club. "We're staging the house for buyers. Real buyers. People want clean lines, not old government dust." I picked up the box and carried it to my truck through the afternoon heat. I carried 22 years of unexploded ordnance flight logs and 3 bronze stars with Valor devices hidden under 30 sheets of yellowed newspaper. The true bleeding, however, didn't happen in the open. It accumulated in the silent, black ink of my banking ledger, every month for 15 years. While I was deployed in maritime exclusion zones where the air smelled of wet rust and raw radar frequency, my service pay was routed into a dual-signature family trust account designed to support our mother's medical care. After she passed, the transfers didn't stop. I had left the automation active, a strategic oversight born from operational exhaustion. Garrick didn't notify me. Instead, he treated my hazard pay as a private, unearned subsidy for his corporate performance. 3 years. First of every month. $4,150. Automatic transfer. Over $149,000 total. That was my combat flight premium earned 40 feet above freezing water while my cockpit gauges screamed with low-altitude alerts poured directly into a corporate credit line to pay the lease on Bethany's third European SUV. I remember sitting in the airfield office at 2 a.m. last winter, the screen of my laptop illuminating the small scars on my knuckles. I opened the transaction submenu, line item after line item. Transfer to Jennings Global Corporate Premium account? I didn't call him. I didn't send an email containing hot, frantic anger. I simply clicked the transaction history, expanded the 3-year matrix, and printed the entire number wall onto 4 sheets of legal paper. I folded them twice, slid them into the pocket of my grease-stained flight jacket, and sat in the dark, listening to the marsh frogs. The logic of a campaign requires you to let the target commit completely to their position before you cut the supply lines. The transition of my life's work into a family joke was systematic. Garrick told the extended family that I did paperwork near the water, before eventually shortening it to the desk girl. He used the word props when referencing my old service insignia if it ever came up at Sunday dinners. "It's cute," he told a group of local city council members during a backyard barbecue while flipping prime rib with silver-plated tongs. Sarah always did love playing soldier. Some people joined the PTA. My sister joined the civil service to get out of her hometown. I stood 7 feet away, holding a plate of cold potato salad. I watched his white New Balance sneakers, his perfectly pressed linen shirt, and the absolute certainty in his eyes that he was the largest animal in the forest. The Cold War turned hot on the first Monday of October. I was sitting at my desk at the airfield, watching the rain strike the corrugated tin roof in a relentless, metallic roar that made the old VHF radio hum with static. The storm had been brewing for 3 days, a low-pressure system coming up from the Carolinas that smelled of rotting marsh grass and wet slate. The door to the office slammed open, throwing a fine mist of rainwater across my logbooks. Garrick stood in the entryway, his hair wet, his breath short. He didn't look at me. He looked at the wooden table where my coffee cup sat. "The Vance Group is bidding on the military logistics contract for the Norfolk expansion," he said, skipping any preamble. He tossed a thick, cerulean blue binder onto my desk. It was marked Proprietary Jennings Global. "We need the internal routing codes for the Naval Supply Systems Command at Cheatham Annex. I know you used to stamp those clearance forms when you were at Fort Meade. I need the bypass protocols for the Maritime Manifest." I looked at the blue binder. The rain outside seemed to intensify, a solid wall of gray water drowning the runway lights. "Classification lines aren't commercial property, Garrick," I said, my voice matching the flat, gray tone of the day. "They aren't for lease." He let out a short, sharp bark of a laugh that ended in a snort. "Classified? Sarah, you were a GS-7 secretary. You typed the manifests. You didn't invent them. Stop acting like you're in a Tom Clancy novel. The Vance Group is putting $4 million into my firm next month based on this expansion. If I don't have those routing logistics by Friday, the deal stalls." He stepped closer, the smell of expensive cologne and damp wool rolling off him. He leaned over the desk, pinning his palms to the wood. "Our father died with 40 grand in the bank and a broken truck. I am building a dynasty here. I funded your car repair last winter. Remember? I paid the drainage fee on your cottage. You owe this family your cooperation. Sign the affidavit in the back of that binder stating you verified these logistics during your tenure. Nobody is going to check the signature of a retired clerk." Training took over. Not anger, not revenge. Training. The cold mechanical sequencing that triggers when you are kneeling in 4 inches of black bilge water with an acoustic mine ticking between your knees. Your heart rate slows. Your vision sharpens down to the millimeter. Your thumb finds the safety catch without your brain having to command it. "I will not sign it," I said. Garrick stared at me for 3 long seconds. His jaw twitched. "Then you're out," he whispered. "The family dinner this Friday at the Pavilion, the anniversary celebration for Jennings Global, don't bother showing up as a guest. Arthur bought out the VIP tier. I won't have you sitting at the head table looking like a funeral director while I'm trying to close a 7-figure contract with the Port Authority." "I understand," I said. 2 hours after Garrick left, the wind shifted to the northeast, lifting the rusty, corrugated tin on the edge of our father's old riverside workshop with a low, metallic shriek. I drove there before the county closed the bridge due to flooding. The building was a gray cedar structure sitting on green pine pilings over the mudflats. Garrick had already attached a yellow corporate sign to the padlock hook. "Property of Jennings Global Future Fleet Parking Detachment." Inside, the air was cold and heavy with the scent of damp sawdust, old gear oil, and the sulphurous bite of the welding torches my father had laid down 14 years ago. A single bulb hung from a black wire, swinging slightly in the draft. I found Garrick's father-in-law, Arthur Vance, standing near the workbench with a silver digital measuring tape. He was projecting a thin red laser line across the cedar beams where my father used to store his old flight logs and hull inspections. Garrick stood behind him, holding an iPad with an architectural rendering of a concrete retaining wall. "The foundation is shot," Garrick told Arthur, completely ignoring my wet boots as I stepped inside. "We tear it down to the pilings, dump 20 tons of granite crush over the marsh, and we can park 8 triaxle rigs here. It gives the port inspectors a visual anchor when they arrive for the contract tour. This workshop belongs to the estate, Garrick," I said, my back resting against the heavy oak vise my father had bolted to the bench in 1982. It wasn't cleared for demolition. Garrick turned, his thumb tapping the iPad screen with an aggressive, rhythmic clack. His voice took on that loud, familiar public resonance he used for city council meetings. "The estate is dead, Sarah. The free market doesn't maintain monuments to small-time tradesmen. Arthur's firm is restructuring our entire land use. This old shed is just an eyesore holding back a 7-figure logistics clearance." He walked over to a stack of green wooden crates in the corner crates I had marked with yellow grease pencils during my second tour in the Mediterranean. He kicked the bottom box with his leather shoe. The wood split, spilling out a corroded bronze marine compass and 3 leather-bound logs of hull vibration analyses. "Look at this junk," Garrick laughed, turning to Arthur. "My sister spent 20 years collecting government scrap while the rest of the county was building actual businesses. She thinks because Dad gave her an old anchor ornament, this dirt belongs in a history museum." Arthur Vance didn't look up from his laser measure. His voice was dry, institutional, and empty of malice. "The maritime expansion requires clean acreage, Miss Jennings. Loud sentimentality doesn't satisfy a state audit. Your brother understands the weight of commercial real estate. You should let him manage the clearance." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't explain that the split crate contained the operational dive records for every hull inspection performed on the Atlantic Fleet's mine countermeasure vessels between 2004 and 2011, records that Vance's own transport ships relied on to enter the channel without tearing their bottoms out. I reached down, picked up the broken piece of bronze compass casing from the floorboards, and slid it into my pocket beside the number wall. "The clearance will happen," I said quietly. "Exactly on schedule." I turned and walked back to my truck, leaving the door of the shed open to the incoming rain. I dialed a 10-digit number from memory, a secure line that routed through the regional switching center at Fort Meade before dropping into a windowless basement office in Arlington. The phone rang exactly twice. "Jennings?" a voice answered. It was Master Chief Leon Briscoe, a man whose skin looked like boiled leather, and who still carried 3 fragments of an Iraqi mortar shell in his left calf from a day in 2009 when we both lived inside a smoke-filled crater near Fallujah. "Leon," I said, "I need the dress whites, the ones from the 2018 citation ceremony." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint, rhythmic click of his heavy brass lighter opening and closing, a habit he picked up when he stopped smoking cigarettes 20 years ago. "They're sealed in the garment vault at the Navy Yard Detachment, boss," Briscoe said, his voice dropping into the gravelly cadence of a man who had spent 30 years answering to flag officers. "The silver lace on the shoulder boards has been polished every 6 months. I did it myself." "Are we going to war?" "No," I said, looking out at the rain turning the airfield into a swamp of red clay. "The universe is just about to correct an assumption. I need you at the gate of the Norfolk Pavilion on Friday at 1700. Bring the logbooks from the Hormuz extraction." "Understood, Commander," Briscoe said. "I'll have the staff car authorized through regional transport." "Do you want the full medals or the ribbons?" "The ribbons," I said. "The medals make too much noise when you walk." The storm hit its peak at exactly 2100 on Friday night. Inside the grand ballroom of the Maritime Pavilion, the 3 crystal chandeliers hummed faintly with the vibration of the emergency generators. 200 guests, the elite of the Hampton Roads shipping community, local maritime attorneys, and 3 members of the State Port Commission sat over plates of seared sea bass and prime rib. Garrick stood at the podium at the front of the room, his chest puffed out like a male pigeon in spring. He had just finished explaining how Jennings Global Logistics had single-handedly kept the regional supply lines open during the winter shortages. "And I want to thank my father-in-law, Arthur Vance," Garrick bellowed into the microphone, his voice echoing off the high marble walls. "A man who knows that true strength isn't something you hide in a government basement. True strength is what you build with your bare hands in the free market." The applause was loud, polite, and thick with the scent of tax-deductible charity. Garrick looked down at table 18, the small round table near the kitchen doors where I sat between an assistant pastry chef and a local printer. He smiled, a small, sharp glint of pure victory. He lifted his champagne flute toward me in a mock toast. "We have some people in our family who spent 20 years taking a government paycheck to stay invisible," Garrick said, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial tone that carried perfectly through the House speakers. "They're happy to take the benefits, happy to take the family support when their old trucks break down. But they don't have the stomach for the arena. Let's raise a glass to the paper pushers who keep the desks clean while we build the future." The table laughed. A few people looked back at me, their faces filled with that distant, polite pity reserved for poor relations who are tolerated rather than invited. At that exact second, the heavy oak double doors at the back of the hall didn't just open. They bounced off the brass wall guards with a sound like twin thunderclaps. A wall of wet Atlantic air rushed into the warm, perfume-heavy room, smelling of ozone, salt, and diesel smoke. Every candle on the tables flickered and died simultaneously. Step for step, 4 men entered the room. They weren't wearing tuxedos. They were wearing midnight blue service dress coats with high-standing collars, their trousers creased to knife edges, their boots striking the marble floor with the uniform, metallic thud of a firing squad. At the head of the formation was a man with 4 silver stars pinned to his collar and the crimson sash of the state's executive office slung across his chest. Governor Thomas Albright, former Vice Admiral of the Atlantic Fleet. Beside him walked Master Chief Briscoe, carrying a heavy, leather-bound logbook under his left arm like a weapon. Garrick frozen at the podium. His hand stayed clamped to the champagne glass, his fingers white. He knew the governor. He had spent 6 months trying to get an appointment with his chief of staff to pitch a logistics contract. He immediately cleared his throat, adjusting his lapels as he prepared to step down from the stage to offer a hand. "Governor Albright," Garrick said into the live microphone, his voice cracking slightly with excitement. "What an unexpected honor. We didn't realize your office was reviewing our maritime gala tonight." Albright didn't look at the stage. He didn't look at Arthur Vance, who had stood up so fast his chair had tipped backward onto the floor. The governor's eyes swept the room with the practiced, lethal precision of a hawk monitoring a field of field mice. He found me. The governor stopped exactly 12 feet from my table. He didn't say a word to the crowd. He brought his heels together with a sharp, leather-on-marble crack that resonated through the dead, silent room. He raised his right hand to the brim of his cover, his fingers perfectly straight, his elbow locked at a precise 45-degree angle. "Commander on deck," the governor commanded, his voice slicing through the ballroom without a microphone. Behind him, the 3 senior officers and Master Chief Briscoe snapped into formation, their salutes cutting through the air like blades. The silence that followed was total. I set my water glass down on the table. The crystal clinked faintly against the porcelain saucer. I stood up slowly, my right hip aching with that familiar, cold fire from the 2017 deck strike. I walked out from behind the fern, my dark wool dress looking like a shadow against the white tablecloths. I didn't salute back. I didn't have my cover on. I simply stepped into the center aisle, stopped 6 inches from the governor, and gave a single, crisp nod of my head. "At ease, Admiral," I said quietly. My voice didn't carry to the back of the room, but it reached Garrick at the podium. Garrick's face had gone completely gray, the color of a dead mackerel on a concrete dock. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again like an animal trying to breathe underwater. "Sarah?" he whispered into the microphone, the sound amplification turning his confusion into a giant, rattling wheeze that filled the ballroom. There's a mistake. She's a clerk. She worked at a supply desk right here in Norfolk." Master Chief Briscoe took 1 step forward. He didn't look at Garrick. He spoke to the room, his voice carrying the flat, terrifying weight of official testimony. "I remember the coordinates," Briscoe said, his eyes fixed on the back wall. "The 14th of April 2018, Northern Persian Gulf, Sea State 6. The extraction transport had suffered a total engine failure within 3 miles of an active Iranian anti-ship missile battery." The hull was slipping toward the shoals. The command structure said nobody was going in due to the weather. Briscoe turned his head slowly, looking directly at Garrick. Commander Sarah Jennings, call sign Ghost Spectre, flew a Seahawk helicopter into the eye of that system at 040 feet above the white caps. She held that aircraft steady by sheer muscle and blood for 47 minutes while we hauled 14 sailors out of the water. She didn't check the manifests, sir. She saved the fleet. He set the heavy leather logbook down on table 1, directly over Arthur Vance's untouched plate of prime rib. The silver-embossed letters on the cover read, Operational Command Log HMS Extraction Squad. 14 soldiers made it home alive, Briscoe concluded. Garrick's hand finally let go of the champagne glass. It didn't shatter on the carpet. It tipped into a silver gravy boat with a dull, muffled clink. I looked up at my brother on the stage. I didn't smile. I didn't show victory. I felt only the deep, heavy exhaustion of a person who had spent 30 years watching small men build castles out of sand. Wrong assumption, Garrick, I said. The private room behind the pavilion kitchen smelled of pine cleaner and old floor wax. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead, casting a flickering green light across the gray plastic chairs where Garrick sat with his head in his hands. The tuxedo jacket was gone, thrown into a corner laundry bin. His white shirt was soaked with sweat at the armpits. Arthur Vance stood near the small window, staring out at the flashing blue lights of the state police escort that had accompanied the governor. His hands were stuffed deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched as if he were trying to shrink himself out of the room's dimension. I stood by the door, my coat over my arm. The Port Authority called my cell phone 5 minutes ago, Sarah, Garrick whispered, his voice cracking like dry kindling. They're pulling the expansion bid. They said they can't do business with a firm that's under federal review for misrepresenting military clearance codes on a state manifest. Arthur's investors are backing out by midnight. We're looking at a $2.1 million default by Monday morning. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a frantic, childlike terror. You have to tell them. Tell the governor it was a joke. A family joke. We were just teasing you about the desk job. You're my sister, Sarah. We share the same blood. Dad's blood. I looked at him for a long moment, my face as still as the water in a dry dock. You spent 15 years using my deployment pay to finance your luxury leases, Garrick, I said, my voice steady and cold. You took $40,000 for a Porsche deposit while I was sitting 40 feet below a minefield. You threw our father's flight logs into the trash because they didn't have clean lines. I stepped closer, until the shadow of my wool coat fell across his wet face. You didn't love Dad's blood, Garrick. You just liked the color of his money. And now, the supply lines are closed. Sarah, please, he sobbed, reaching for my sleeve. I stepped back, out of his reach, and opened the door to the alleyway where the rain was finally slowing to a thin, coastal mist. I let you believe it, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. That was my mistake. It won't happen again. The reaction of a poorly engineered structure under load is never instantaneous. It moves through predictable phases of structural failure. By Tuesday afternoon, the state procurement portal had locked the registration profile for Jennings Global Logistics. The crimson notice on the screen didn't name emotions. It listed codes: status suspended pending character and integrity review under Federal Provision 47B. At 4:18 p.m., the local branch of Southern Maritime Bank executed a cross-collateralization clause on Garrick's personal accounts. The line item in his digital ledger dropped from a functional balance to a red negative marker of $87,430. I watched the metrics update from the small terminal at the airfield hangar. My personal hazard pay siphons had been severed 48 hours prior. Without that steady transfusion of $4,150 on the first of the month, the corporate credit card line dissolved like salt in water. Bethany called my radio line at midnight during the high tide. The background noise through the receiver was the sound of her packing cardboard boxes, the crisp, heavy slide of packing tape crossing cardboard over and over. "The dealership called about the lease," she said, her voice dry, stripped of the rehearsed country club tone. "They're recovering the truck from the driveway tomorrow morning. Garrick is sitting in the kitchen with a calculator, Sarah. He hasn't turned the lamps on since Sunday. His partners ran a real background search. They know he never held the defense clearances he promised the Port Authority. The whole alliance is gone. You have to call Arthur. Tell his bank it was an accounting oversight." I took a slow pull of my black coffee. "There is no oversight, Bethany," I said, looking out at the red warning light pulsing on the runway tower. "The numbers are simply reflecting the truth. Only liars have a reason to fear the ledger." I replaced the receiver on the hook. The last I heard from the county court records, Arthur Vance signed over his remaining logistics warehouses to a regional container firm based out of Savannah to satisfy his default penalties. His name was removed from the board of directors before the winter freeze. The loud empire they had built on my silence, financed by my blood, and decorated with a stolen history, had officially ceased to exist. 4 months after the night at the pavilion, the bank foreclosed on the glass office tower on the Elizabeth River. Last I heard, Garrick was working as a junior manager at a used car lot 40 miles inland, earning a fraction of his old salary and driving a rusted sedan with a slipping transmission. The Vance Group filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy 3 weeks ago after the federal audit cleared their logistics history. Reality has a clean way of correcting a false assumption when you finally stop carrying the weight of other people's arrogance. I stood on the edge of the wooden dock near my cottage this morning. The storm was completely gone, replaced by that vast, pale blue Virginia sky that looks like it goes on until the edge of the world. The salt water looked gray and steady beneath the pilings. Rhythmic, heavy, and correct. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the old, laminated science fair certificate from 1987. The model destroyer I'd built out of scrap metal when I was 10 years old, the one my father had shrugged at before walking away. On the back, in his heavy, greasy handwriting that I hadn't discovered until after his death, he had written 5 words: "Built to hold the storm." He had seen the steel inside me before I ever knew what a uniform looked like. He had hidden it in the wood because he knew the loud ones wouldn't understand the weight of it anyway. If this story meant something to you, if you have spent years keeping quiet while louder, emptier voices took up all the space in your room, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs that reminder today. Don't wait for them to see you. Just stand steady. The universe always does its own announcing in the end.